question I wanted to ask you, Bill, is that what does the international community think about the situation? Why don't we see outrage about Africa's last colony? Do you think it has something to do with the colonizing nation being inside Africa and not one of the original European ones?
Yes, absolutely. And it also has to do with a few other things. One is an active lobbying effort by Morocco. What Morocco did, one of the things that they did was that they started going to countries in Africa, particularly that had recognized the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which I should add is one of the founding countries of the African Union. When OAU ended and they formed the African Union, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic was part of that, and they were part of the founding of this. But the Moroccans have gone to different countries and they have convinced, using various methods, some countries to revoke their recognition. So the aim there is to isolate Western Sahara. It's very much like the Abraham Accords that, that Trump started to move to try to get the Arab world to abandon Palestine and thereby strangle the Palestinian movement. The Moroccans are trying to do exactly the same thing. The other aspect, one other aspect to this has to do with spheres of influence, that there is some, as I said before, Morocco is essentially a neo-colony of France. There are some countries that don't want to muck around with Morocco because they see the imprint of France, and they're worried about that. And so, but then there's another factor. The other factor is that not enough hell has been raised about Western Sahara around the world. So if you think about, let's think about South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement. Apartheid gets introduced into South Africa in 1948 when the National Party wins. There begins struggle within South Africa, but the bulk of international attention on South Africa doesn't really happen until the 1960s and then the 1970s. So it took a long time for a global movement to develop. And that's part of what needs to happen right now. We need a global movement that is putting pressure on Morocco. And I would argue that forcing Morocco to change should actually be a lot easier than forcing the apartheid government in South Africa to collapse.
Has there been any sort of like kind of BDS movements for Western Sahara, like you
Very
see
limited.
with Israel Palestine?
Yeah, very limited. There are, as I mentioned before, the Western Sahara Resource Watch has brought to the attention of people various multinational corporations that are doing business in Western Sahara. And in some cases, some companies have been pressured successfully to leave Western Sahara. So this is not a story of gloom and doom. But what has not happened is a concentrated effort that's analogous to BDS on Morocco. And that's where things, as I found out recently, get somewhat complicated. So on the one hand, you'll have people that will make claims or organizations that will say, boycott Morocco. Mm-hmm. Well, that and a couple of bucks will get you across town. That's not the way boycotts work. Boycotts are really an act of war in the sense that you've got to really understand your opponent. You've got to surround them. You've got to strangle them and force them to change. You don't just put out a call. One of the things that I didn't understand is that there's many people in Europe that are actually afraid to go after Morocco because, as you probably know, Morocco is a gate to Europe for refugees. And Morocco is playing the role that Gaddafi was playing with Libya vis-a-vis Europe of saying, I will hold back all of these African migrants from going to Europe if you basically pay me off. And so there's a fear, because every so often what Spain says is, hey, you keep messing with us, and we're going to let all these African migrants into Europe. And then these European countries start vibrating, right? And they back down. And that's even affected some supporters of the Sahrawis who are not very sanguine on, let's say, for instance, unsettling the Moroccan economy.
Mm-hmm.
But they are in favor of putting pressure on multinational corporations, hoping that if you basically get enough of them to withdraw, the Moroccan investment there will effectively collapse. I don't happen to subscribe to that, but that's the argument.
You know, something you said earlier really stuck with me when you said that there's two Africas, right?
Mhm.
Pretty much the dark Africa and the lighter hued,
the
mocha colored Africa.
Right.
All right.
Right.
And it's fascinating to think about, because as you said that, I'm 46 and I was immediately transported back into the mid to late 80s when the culture industry also too was very vehement about their stance on boycotting South Africa. Right. There was that "I'm not going to play Sun City" song.
Yeah.
Definitely, it was like a theme in early Spike Lee movies, because that was a theme on college campuses. Pascal, you were in school during that time as well, and you said you were Larry Fishburne's character in
no, I
school
did
days,
not.
right?
Did not say I was Larry Fishburne's character in school days. I didn't do that.
But is it harder, in your opinions, for African Americans who love claiming Egypt?
Yes.
All the hoteps. We can pull up so many videos of some dude on the Breakfast Club show saying that all black people are kings and they got an Ankh necklace on as big as LA.
Jason, can I expand the
Sure,
premise?
please.
I mean, I might ask a bit of an inflammatory question here. I think Bill might be willing to take. Are we at a precipice in terms of Black American political consciousness where we are so divorced and distanced from the Black power internationalism of Pan-Africanism of the late 60s, early 70s during the anti-colonial era of that period, that the understanding of the concept of Pan-Africanism is divorced from domestic Black consciousness in a way that it's never been before, even going back to the 19th century. Particularly, we see the rise of things like the ADOS movement, where there's an active, almost antagonism to consciousness, to the consciousness that comes around with things like Pan-Africanism.
Yeah. So how long is this podcast? We got another 2 or 3 hours.
We got time, brother. This we call this the free show Saturday, so we just go on Saturday.
All right, no, because I mean, this is critical. So I would say that a few things happened that have resulted in the rise of groups like ADOS. That beginning in so the high point of national liberation struggles globally was 1979.
Okay.
When the Nicaraguan Revolution succeeded, the Grenadian Revolution succeeded, and by that point the Portuguese colonies were free, and then we had also struggles in Africa that ultimately resulted in the liberation of freedom of Angola and South Africa by 1994. But really, in a lot of ways, the high point was around 1979. And one of the things that starts to unfold largely in the 1980s, in part as a result of the rise of neoliberalism, but only in part, is that there's a crisis in many of the anti-colonial governments that come after the end of colonialism, the Egypt under, that had been under Nasser, for example, or Mozambique after Samora Machel was killed and after the war against Renamo ended, etc. And what you start to see that goes back a point you were raising, Pascal, is that class struggle is playing out in a lot of these countries in a way that's not to the advantage of the masses of people. And you have the rise of new elites,
the neo-colonial bourgeoisie,
which then becomes at a certain point linked in with what many people call a transnational capitalist class. And even though these folks will often use nationalist rhetoric, they are also very domestically repressive and are advancing very regressive economic and social policies, including what we've just seen, in Uganda with the anti-LGBTQ stuff, in Gambia, etc., in Ghana. So part of what's happened is that there's been a retreat from the emancipatory politics of much of the anti-colonial movement, and the crisis of the socialist countries as well links in with this. And we've been seeing defeats. And nature abhors a vacuum. And what happens is when this retreat unfolds, we start to see this other kind of politics emerge. And this politics, this right-wing approach that even infects Black America, that argues that usually on an ethno-national basis, we have to cut the best deal we can with imperialism. And ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery, go further and say that essentially Africa is irrelevant to African Americans. And in fact, we shouldn't even call ourselves African Americans. We should call ourselves freedmen. We're really Americans. So they want to make a complete break with the rest of the African world, and try to find a place within a neo-apartheid United States. So I think to a great extent, we're engaged in fighting what a lot of the rest of the world is fighting, right-wing ethno-nationalist politics, where people are in effect trying to find peace with imperialism to the exclusion of all else. So you see the rise of xenophobia, for instance, in South Africa, where a country that had sent refugees and migrants throughout the continent during apartheid, then after the end of apartheid, when African migrants are coming to South Africa, in part because the wealth gap has never been closed in South Africa, you end up getting this xenophobic thing. We don't want Zimbabweans here. We don't want Malawians here. We don't want Mozambicans here. And things just start going to hell. And so this is part of what we're up against. And it actually relates to then going back to Western Sahara, which is where people will say, why should I care about what's happening in Western Sahara? And even Jason, it's funny when you were saying about Egypt. So many African Americans will look at Egypt with pride, but increasingly you find people saying, well, I'm not going to look at Egypt exactly. I'm going to look at the Black folks in the southern part of Egypt, and the Nubians, and take pride in them, as if there was some tremendous wall between the Nubians and everyone else. And if you go to North Africa, which I have once, I was in Tunisia and Egypt, I looked around. I'll say when I was in Tunisia, it's the only time in my life where I didn't feel like I stood out. And I saw people, all shades of the rainbow, that were there. And a lot of us think of North Africa as Elizabeth Taylor or something.
Is that the failure though of the way that we historicize race in America as well?
Yes.
Like we have this idea that it's always
binary.
been race first. You know,
Yes.
Binary notion is a very sick binary notion of black white that we have that comes out of the United States. It affects how we look at places like Haiti.
That's right.
That very much taint the ability to make analysis in foreign international realities. And you combine that with the lack of class analysis, and it makes the prism from which the American lens looks at the world very skewed and very difficult to get through any crux of truth.
That's right.
Would you say that's the problem with 1619?
It's a problem with the 1619 project. And I'm not jumping on them, attacking them at all. But you see, the thing about it, and it relates to these novels that I've written, which I'll get into in a second, is that in order to understand race in the United States, you cannot just look at the African American experience. You have to look at the experience of the indigenous. You have to look at the experience of the Mexicans who were captured. You have to look at the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos. You've got to look at Hawaii. You got to look at Micronesia. You got to look at Puerto Rico. And so when you restrict it to African Americans as defining black versus whites, then you get into real problems. See, I wrote these two novels in the last few years. The first one is called The Man Who Fell from the Sky, and the second is called The Man Who Changed Colors. And they're murder mysteries about race, class, revenge, and Cape Verdean Americans. Now, most people in the United States not only don't know much about Western Sahara, they don't know much about Cape Verdeans. So you mentioned Cape Verdeans, and they'll look at you like you just started speaking
in tongues,
right? And so Cape Verde, the archipelago is 500 miles off the coast of West Africa, and the Cape Verdeans were the first people of African descent post 1492 to come to the United States voluntarily. First, in the 19th century, they did not come as slaves. They came on whaling ships and fishing ships, and they came as subject to Portuguese colonialism. And part of the reason I decided to do this relates to what you were raising, Pascal. When you look at the Cape Verdean experience here, it shows how complicated race is, and that it doesn't break down very easily, because Cape Verdeans are all shades of the rainbow. They came here speaking Portuguese or Criollo. They were mainly Catholic, and they had not been slaves. And they encountered this population of African descent that were overwhelmingly the descendants of slaves, Protestant and English speaking. And so there was this real challenge in terms of the way these populations interacted up until actually fairly recently. And that's what I cover in the first book. And so a lot of the way that we treat race is very narrow. So it's very hard for US African Americans to, not only understand Haitians, but Lord knows to understand Latinos. And so because of the Spanish system of white supremacy, premised on this notion that was called Las Castas, you have all of these breakdowns that are not replicated in the United States. When you go to Africa, I've been to Africa a number of times, and you see what I look like. And so when I go there, and when I've been to Latin America, people will sometimes say, well, Bill, what are you? And if I say I'm Black, that starts a whole interesting discussion, which I ultimately turn into a joke, right? Because I'll say to people, well, you have an unclarity as whether I'm Black. But if I land in New York and I say I'm anything other than black, I'll be put in a straitjacket and taken to an insane asylum. So why is that? Which opens up incredible discussions. So when we're looking at Western Sahara or looking at North Africa, this is Africa. This is the complexity of Africa that included migrations from the Arab world and some migrations from Europe, migrations from southern parts of Africa up. It's very complicated and does not break down in the way that we largely understand race in the United States.